Welcome to We Do, the officially unofficial podcast for Watchmen on HBO and one of 36 different podcasts answering the question, who watches The Watchmen? I'm Jim.
I'm A.Ron.
And we're here today to do a season one. I don't even know what to call this. We're here to do a preview for The Watchmen TV show. A.Ron, I know we have a whole outline here. You want to talk about some of the themes of the old stuff?
There's so much to talk about, and I have done so much prep for this podcast.
I did at least 3.5 hours. I watched the old movie.
In the last 2 months, I read the entire original comic book. I watched the movie with the director's cut, with the Black Freighter animatics or animated scenes put in it. I've done tons of research, but it's a big sprawling topic, and clearly there's a lot of Lindelofian type mysteries and subtext stuff to unravel. But I thought a good place to start, since not a lot of people have probably done that amount of research. And there's also a lot of, I think, interest in this because not so much that it's a Watchmen production, but because it's a Lindelof production. And the last time he did something was, Slap Your Mom in the Mouth Good. Yeah. The Leftovers, and one of our favorite podcasts that we've ever done. I thought it might be a good idea to kind of run down The Watchmen, just a basic outline and its premises, some of the different crucial differences between its world and ours, and then kind of review the characters who survive that experience in The Watchmen and who apparently play a role in the series going forward. So if that sounds good, we'll start, and then we'll get into other things about the series proper. But first we're going to do some recap and review. So in the series of the Watchmen. The premise is in the 30s there was a wave of crime involving masked criminals, and these people were unable to be prosecuted because no one could identify them. So the cops, in retaliation, started wearing masks themselves, taking flamboyant personas like the Night Owl, Hooded Justice, Captain Metropolis, becoming kind of conventional superheroes. Not in the vein of Spider-Man or Superman, but more in the vein of like Batman, where they were they trained themselves to be peak human in various capacities, but they didn't really have any superpowers. The interesting thing about this led to subtle other cultural changes. Like, for example, in the Watchmen universe, comic books are not about superheroes because that was happening in real life. Instead, they became obsessed. Their primary genre was pirates. Also, in this cultural milieu, Richard Nixon was a very popular president, able to overturn the amendment precluding presidents for serving more than 2 terms, and served 5 terms, won the Vietnam War, made Vietnam our 51st American state. And as a result, there was never a moment where America had to kind of soberly evaluate itself on the world stage. Yeah. That we didn't have a humiliating defeat in Vietnam. And this kind of led to one of the reasons that the 1985 universe of The Watchmen is such a pressure cooker. So there is one exception to that. Heroes don't have superpowers, and that's Dr. Manhattan. How would you describe Dr. Manhattan, Jim?
Nearly a god. He's about as close to a god as you can get without being one.
Yeah.
He has the power to manipulate things at an atomic level. Even lower than that. I mean, he can teleport anything himself. He can recreate matter in whatever ways he chooses. Yeah, he's basically a god, and he's blue, and he's got a big old dick. Apparently,
he's unlike Aladdin's genie in the big dick department. Although I don't know, I never looked inside the genie's pants.
Yeah, I don't.
But otherwise, he's a glowing blue being with unlimited cosmic power.
Yeah.
So the other thing is Manhattan being American gave America a huge decisive edge in the Cold War. It allowed us to, like I said, win Vietnam in like a week of Dr. Manhattan, because like there's scenes in the movies of him just waving. First of all, he's like 1,000 feet tall, and he's just waving his hands across the battlefield, and like all the enemy combatants just explode into gore. So that'll win a war for you. But because of that, and because of kind of the nothing checking American arrogance and exceptionalism, the rest of the world is arrayed against America because there's it's just is a big threat. There's no balance in the Cold War because Dr. Manhattan is an ultimate nuclear deterrent. He's the ultimate winner of any nuclear war. So in 1985, the world is kind of posed on like this nuclear Armageddon. In steps Adrian Veidt, who is this character named Ozymandias, who is billed as the world's smartest and fastest man because he's trained his whole life to be that way. He's also extremely wealthy and ambitious, and he owns a powerful global corporation. And the central plot of the Watchmen revolves around his plan to distract and divide other heroes while he fakes an alien attack. Or in the movie, he fakes it, makes it look like Dr. Manhattan himself turns against humanity and strikes several cities around the world. In the comics, it's an alien invasion, and I hear that in the television series, they're going with the comic book as canon.
Oh, okay.
So
I'm gonna have to look at the end of that then.
Psychic squid monsters invading cities to cause mass destruction. And the reason he did this plot is he thought that what the world needs is a single external threat to unify against. And in the late minutes of the Watchmen unfolding, it appears that he's successful. The world leaders are putting aside their differences to array against a new threat. But there is one complication, which is
Rorschach's journal.
There's a character who has been carefully investigating this whole Veidt conspiracy, and he takes a journal, he drops it at a newspaper office, which you'd think would blow the lid off the whole thing, but the newspaper is the New Frontiersman, an extreme right-wing newspaper, and it gets sorted into the Crank file, where they kind of sort their Alex Jones level conspiracies. So it's one of those things where it's the truth is out there, but it's out there in like a Fox Mulder situation from X-Files. It's out there in a way that like maybe some lonely cranks might know the truth, but how are they going to, how are you going to prove that the moon landings are faked? How are you going to prove that, 9/11 was an inside job? And that's how we end the movie at the end of 1985 with a little bit of bittersweet hope for the future. And the Watchmen series takes place in that same universe in the modern day, 2019. So before we move on to like important characters, I thought it might be interesting to talk about what else we know. We talked about, how the Watchmen changed comic books in the comic book universe. What are some other crucial differences between 2019 non-Watchmen universe and Watchmen universe 2019?
Yeah, I'm not sure how they get here, but apparently there are no cell phones and there's no internet. So it's interesting to me, given some of the themes that we're going to be delving into with the new series, that there would be no internet, because a lot of the things that we associate with the development of those cultures is the internet. And so I don't know what they're getting at with that, but yeah, no cell phones, no internet.
I wonder, so just because there's no cell phones, no internet, I wonder if there'll be analogs, like maybe like BBSs, bulletin board systems, which were all modem based, are going to be like the hub. Because it makes it, to me, it kind of, when I heard that, I'm like, that's fucked up. But then it started making sense, because the thing that led to the creation of the internet was Cold War research into how you survive, how you can maintain military communications and civilian communications in the event of a civil war. Or event of a nuclear war, because the internet's all designed to transport information and reroute around damage. And it came out of this old DARPA projects. So like if the Cold War just fizzled, or the United States is won in the early 80s, maybe that research is canceled and it just never gets that final push to where it becomes this ubiquitous communication platform it is today. But in 1985, you absolutely had BBSs, you absolutely had modems. It would be kind of a cool retro if that's just the, you don't have Reddit, you don't have Facebook, you've got just these popular regional BBSs.
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine it not developing further in 30 years.
Sure.
35 years, whatever it is. But
well, it's interesting, because I think Alan Moore is the only one that actually had this crucial insight to pop culture, that if you had real life superheroes, the public imagination would not be captured by them. Kind of like,
No, Not in the way it is now.
And when we envision, like, anytime like the Marvel universe, people are crazy about superheroes. They're dressing up like them for Halloween. We saw this in Amazon's The Boys. Like, there's still movies made about them and comic books, but it's also just as likely that they would become. You just read about them on the news, and it's like it's a public fascination that way. So no internet, no cell phones. Another big change. We went from having 5 terms, apparently, of President Nixon to a bunch of terms of President Robert Redford.
Literally, President Robert Redford. So
and he's played by Robert Redford.
Yeah, which makes me kind of draw an association with Ronald Reagan, as an actor president, an actor turned president. I don't know how deep they're going to go on that, or if they'll lean into that at all.
I think it's an interesting way to... Because how do you plausibly return 30 some years later to this like pressure cooker social situation, right? So like presumably President Nixon has swung the world in the United States in a very right wing direction. I wonder if they're suggesting with Robert Redford, a famous Hollywood, although you're right, Reagan was a famous Hollywood actor and he was super arch Republican.
Yeah.
I wonder if they're suggesting that you've got now like multiple terms of more of an arch Democrat who's swung the world back into this other direction. And now you've got like the pressure cooker is still built, but it's in like an equal and opposite way. Now you've got, instead of like being about like commies and moral degenerates, it's about races and racism and that, because that seems like it's going to be a big part of the world. Are there any other like notable standout like cultural differences that might be?
No, I mean it has a lot more similarities than it does differences, I think.
Yeah. And that's the thing that's fun about the Watchmen. It's like kind of like you will see like these airships, like blimps are a big thing in the Watchmen universe. Not so much airplanes. So there might be some other things like that, but. I want to talk about important characters from the movies that will probably play a role in the series going forward. Let's talk with a little bit deeper dive into Dr. Manhattan, who used to be John Osterman, which was a nuclear physicist who in 1959 accidentally is exposed to an experiment generating a thing called intrinsic fields, and finds his body ripped apart by these fantastic energies, and it takes him months to learn how to rebuild himself atom by atom, but eventually does, and he reconstitutes himself as a god. Dr. Manhattan doesn't have any weaknesses like kryptonite, but what would you say is his fatal flaw or his weakness?
He doesn't understand humanity. Is this a big one, I think?
And why is that? Like, what's his...
I mean, he's outside of time in a lot of ways, or he perceives time very differently than we do, and he understands the universe differently.
Yeah.
And therefore doesn't hold us up as sort of a shining example, or this thing that needs to be protected and saved.
At one point he says, I'm not omniscient, because he has complete access to everything that happens in his past and everything that will happen in his future. So he does have blind spots, and also his other weakness is anything that generates tachyon fields.
Yeah,
which could be a nuclear war, or that's one of the things that Ozymandias used to kind of cloak his activities in the Watchmen. He actually built a generator that just generated that. So he does have, even in his own history, a little bit of blind spots. But in the original work of the Watchmen, he loses his attachment to humanity such that he just exiles himself to Mars. He's brought back by his girlfriend, which enables him to go back and confront Ozymandias. But at the end, he announces his plans to leave the galaxy and maybe try to create a life of his own.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm going to ponder later is like, what in the fuck could possibly re-engage him with humanity 30 more years later?
It's a really good question. I assume it would have to revolve around Laurie in some way, because we do know that she's one of the characters coming back.
Let's talk about Laurie then. So Laurie, and I did not know how to pronounce this, but it's Uspetchik. Is the actual pronunciation. is a second-generation superhero. She's the daughter of the original Silk Spectre, and her mother kind of trains her to be her successor.
And she also goes by Silk Spectre.
She also goes by Silk Spectre. Laura's father is another costume hero called the Comedian, who raped Laurie's mother at a gathering of superheroes back in the day. And they later actually had a problematic relationship, which led to Laurie's conception.
Yeah.
Laurie, go ahead.
I was agreeing.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Laurie discovering that chain of events during the events of the Watchmen causes her to view her life and her mother in an entirely different light. In an HBO series, she's played by Jean Smart, and she's not going by Uspechtik anymore. She's going by Blake, Laurie Blake. Edward Blake was her father, the comedian. So that's a character who's definitely going to be front and center. I want to talk about the comedian a little bit, Edward Blake. What is your reading on the comedian?
The comedian thinks that our society is a big joke, and I think he's the perspective I most agree with in the entirety of the Watchmen.
Wow,
because I don't view the end of the Watchmen as rosy as some people may.
Interesting.
But yeah, he just views everything as a joke, and since he's in on the joke, he just wants to. He's not going to participate in it. He's just gonna go along with it, but just like have his own kind of fun with it.
Yeah, it's like a lot of the masks, they call them, the costumes. They are in it for like
They're trying
truth,
to change
justice,
it.
in the American way, fighting crime. Whereas I feel like the comedian just wears the mask to get out his violent tendencies, and he's kind of like nihilist.
Yeah. Is he violent? I mean, he's certainly violent at times. Is that like his tendency? I don't know.
He does seem like he revels in like shooting people, hurting people.
Yeah, when he's provoked, I think, or when he's given license to. Yeah,
but I mean, that's why I say he's violent, because it seems like he doesn't view it as a means to an end, but he also revels in the means itself.
Yeah.
He's one of the few heroes, quote unquote heroes, who accepts work for the federal government because there's a bunch of riots in the 70s. Police go on strike. This is going to be important in the new series. And the public prefers publicly accountable badges versus mass vigilantes. Rare wisdom shown by the masses and the mobs on the street. And they pass this Keene Act, which bans mass vigilantes. Yeah. And several of the quote-unquote heroes accept work for the federal government, and he's one of them. And they imply that he's behind the assassination of JFK. Apparently, he also murdered Woodward and who's the other guy that was Woodward and Bernstein.
No.
The guys who are responsible for blowing the lid off of Watergate. So Nixon's presidency continued to be protected. And his death sets off the entire chain of events that the Watchmen's about. Yeah. Because he accidentally uncovers this Ozymandias' conspiracy for this world peace. Then I want to talk about Adrian Veidt as Ozymandias. He's would you call him the primary antagonist of the Watchmen? The villain?
I don't know. I mean, Watchmen has a complex relationship with heroes and villains. True. And I think in as much as you would call anybody a hero or a villain, they're kind of both.
He sacrifices millions of random innocent people.
Yeah. He's a greater good kind of guy.
To potentially save a billion people from a thermonuclear war.
He's the antagonist, certainly, to like Rorschach. Like if Rorschach is the protagonist, he's the antagonist, or vice versa.
Right. But yeah, it's hard to say whether it's right. And one of the last things he does in the series or the movies and the comic, is he asks Dr. Manhattan if he did the right thing, potentially sacrificing these to save billions. If it all works out in the end, and Manhattan responds, "Nothing ever ends," which is one of the taglines of this series. And it's suggesting that like all he did is forestall like these same animosities, these same jealousies, these same societal factors. Maybe you hit the snooze button, but this stuff is all going to work its way out to the surface eventually. Let's talk about Rorschach, who is Walter Kovacs. Boy, what do you say about Rorschach?
He is a moral absolutist.
Yeah,
and he's willing to enforce that via any measure of violence necessary. He's also a little crazy.
But like you said, the Watchmen has a complex relationship with his heroes and villains. Is that you start off thinking that Rorschach is a crazy psychopath. I think you end with that thought too. But like when you reveal his complicated history and how he was raised and his early forays into crime fighting, you kind of understand. Yeah. Like he's seen some sick shit, and he's come by his opinions of society pretty fucking honestly. Now in the year, so he dies because he's the one Watchman that Adrian Veidt can't convince that this is like, yeah, it sucks that all these millions of people die, but if you blow the lid off this conspiracy, they die for nothing. Yeah. Now they're dead for like potentially billions of saved. He's the one guy because, as you say, he's a moral absolute that says, fuck this. I don't compromise in the face of Armageddon, and he's going to tell the world, and Dr. Manhattan explodes him.
But he does end up telling the world, potentially. Like, and that's where I don't have the rosy view of like, well, Adrian, preserved a peace here.
Right.
Because Rorschach sort of blows the lid off of it, or could blow the lid off of it with his journal. Yeah. That he slipped into the news office.
Now, the interesting thing is that in the years since The Watchmen in this series, he has inspired this white supremacist group named the 7th Cavalry. Yeah. Who's adopted his mask, his kind of like no compromising creed, and they've added racism. Because you can say a lot of bad things about his worldview, like he is against degenerates, and in his mind, like that includes homosexuality, any kind of sexual deviancy, drug use, anyone that breaks any kind of law. I never saw any hint of racism.
No.
So I think it's super interesting that like his memory has been twisted into that shape.
Although I will say I'm struggling to recall that there was even a single black person or non-white person at all in the entirety of Watchmen movie.
The psychologist that worked with Walter, and there's a kid on the street that reads comic books.
Okay.
You're right.
So I don't know that he has much interaction or much opportunity to espouse his views on race.
Yeah, I guess that's a fair point too. It's like if he's like super right-wing conservative 80s, racism's probably not in the mix.
Probably, yeah. But he's given an opportunity through what's the original Minutemen Silhouette, because she's a lesbian and he gets an opportunity to comment on that. Certainly in the film.
Mm-hmm. Something like disapproving about her lifestyle or her degeneracy. Mm-hmm. So, and it seems like this is propelling a lot of the 7th Cavalry that's wearing his masks and using his name is propelling a lot of the action, because their increasingly violent attacks against police have caused the police officers to begin wearing masks while doing their duties to protect themselves and their families.
Yeah, is interesting. It's sort of the whole genesis of the Minutemen in the first place is coming back around in a slightly different way, like a small twist on it. Yeah. But for a modern day portrayal of it.
Right. Now it's not masks, badges, not masks. It's mask wearing badges. And it'll be interesting to see what the public unrest is going to look like about that. Yeah. And the final character is Night Owl, Daniel Dreiberg, which is a Batman analog. Like he's literally just Batman. Yep.
He's got all the ships and gadgets.
The only thing that's different is that he hides his wealth. He kind of lives as a shabby in the 1985 Watchmen. He lives as kind of a shabby mid-30s retiree because he spends all of his money on his technology and gadgets, and lives he's like doesn't hide around as a billionaire playboy. And at the end of the original, him and Laurie have kind of fallen in love and are an item. So that's all the characters I think that we need to know from the original movie. I want to talk about themes from the movies that dovetail in the series. We already talked about badges, not masks. Mm-hmm. I thought there was another interesting thing running through the movie and the book, which is the concept of miracles. Okay. Because that's what ultimately brings Dr. Manhattan back, because he's like, I don't see the intrinsic value in human beings. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that miracles exist. And in uncovering the story of Laurie's background, it seems to impress him that like this improbable sequence of events that led to her creation is, in his view, a miracle. He's described this like spinning gold out of air.
I don't know about this. This seems a little too romantic. This seems like a bit of romantic writing instead of like, let's follow the conclusions. The logical conclusion of this character is he would view he's zooming in on a single occurrence, whereas if he were to zoom out larger, bigger picture, which is what Dr. Manhattan fucking does, he would see that these miracles, quote unquote, happen a billion times a second.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing special about this one particular person.
Yeah.
Just that, it has an interesting backstory. It's not special.
Well, it's interesting because Ozymandias, who is billed as the smartest man on the earth, and there's nothing in the series to suggest otherwise. He's got this thing at the end where he's describing like all the different machinations he put into place to cause this plan to happen. He's like, most people assume that Dr. Manhattan has lost his humanity, but I was able to see the subtle clues that show that he was essentially just openly crying.
Yeah.
Kind of framed Dr. Manhattan not as a person who's lost his humanity, but like as a person who's gone through a severe trauma. Like a person who maybe suddenly is blind and deaf or like lost their limbs and like is in a profound depression about the state he's found himself in, but he still he still has those emotions. This is kind of like a front. Yeah. So I guess the question is, do you believe Ozymandias' interpretation of Manhattan's psychological
Well,
state?
they portray him as drifting farther and farther away from humanity, right?
Yeah. But even so, like we've talked a lot about on our various podcasts that like psychological health, like coming from like a state of being addiction to being healthy, is often portrayed in fiction as like just a straight climb up a mountain. When in reality, it's a lot of slip and fall and tumble, and then a couple feet back up and slip and fall. I imagine descents are the same way. Like it's not just a gradual, like you could reach plateaus. You might have something that reminds you of your humanity, and so I guess it didn't surprise me that something could spark his humanity because he kind of probably wants to be human still. My question is, 35 years later, what is a miracle, or what point of view change could he have in another universe that could bring him back to Earth? Because I think that they've made it clear that he has been gone since 1985. I don't know.
If you take him at his word, he wants to go create some life for himself. That could have some pretty profound
being
effects
a father
on you.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, if that's the metaphor that they're going for. But also like being a god. Like, what if you weren't born a god? What if you became a god, and then you were trying to create life, and you found out that the same sort of patterns that you saw in humans, you were unable to eliminate from the life that you're creating, right? No matter how hard you try.
Right.
I don't know if all this can happen in 35 years.
Yeah.
That's not a long time for life to exist, but he could try several iterations.
That's an interesting
So maybe
thought.
he comes back thinking, well, this experiment turns out this way no matter what. I'm actually part of this more than I thought I was.
Well, this is kind of this is one of the reasons I love the Watchmen, because you can just talk about philosophy all day long with it. But like,
yeah.
What you just said makes me think of like, what if it's the opposite's true? Because like, Dr. Manhattan several times mentions that he doesn't personally believe there's a God, that like we all just happened here by accident. No one's here to tell us what to do. No one's here to guide us. No one's here to like design a perfect world for us. But he's in a situation, if he decides to become a creator, he could be a present God. He could be an actual, and I wonder if like, in the process of creating life, it actually goes better than expected, and he starts thinking like, man, it really sucks all those monkeys on the planet Earth that didn't have these advantages, these privileges that my life forms do. They're really these lost, failed, rudderless creations. Maybe I should go and like be an actual god. Like, what if Manhattan decided to be some kind of god for humanity?
How do you tell that story and tell the story that the series seems to want to tell about the 7th Cavalry and the masks versus masks? Because I think whatever story you try to tell, if the involvement of Dr. Manhattan is that large and that relevant, I don't know how you tell both of those stories.
I don't know, Damon. How do you tell those stories?
One would definitely sort of usurp the show at some point, and I'm pretty sure it's not the 7th Cavalry.
But here's the thing. That's what I think about Dr. Manhattan coming back at all. Like Dr. Manhattan, no matter what's going on in the Earth, Dr. Manhattan returning in any capacity is the headline of the day. Why does he come back if it's just like, I left those cufflinks I really liked.
Yeah, maybe he's just visiting Lori.
And they're made out of platinum, and for whatever reason in this galaxy there's no platinum. I need to get him. All right, I got him. Bye. Like, that's equally ridiculous. So, like,
Yeah.
what role is he going to have to play? Like, him... Because that's the other thing is, like, okay, so he decides he wants to be God of humanity. What does that even mean?
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean he, like, just remakes human? Does he mean he just starts, like how would a God like him... That's the... I guess that's
Could
the
Adrian
interesting
bring him
thing.
back somehow, like inadvertently? Like, is Adrian hatching another plan? Because I know when Lindelof talks about the show, he says that Ozymandias and the main story are not parallel arcs. They are going to collide with one another at some point. Is this, sort of a rerun of Watchmen where he's got another scheme because his first scheme has started to wear off? And
so
that brings
now
Manhattan back.
he tried a fully secular solution, and now maybe I'm clinging to my theory that I created 5 minutes ago, Jim.
Okay.
I'm very protective, like Dr. Manhattan, of his extragalactic creation.
Sure.
I don't want this to be a rudderless theory out on the internet. It could be that sure, they go with the psychic squid monster from the comics and not the fake Dr. Manhattan, but like, what if the 2009 series Ozymandias runs away from the secular solution and is like, maybe we do need religion, and he creates a fake Manhattan to be the god that can shape and guide humanity into the future. Because his first scheme was all about him making subtle moves in the background. Maybe he just needs a spokesperson that's like going to lay it all out in the line.
Maybe he becomes Dr. Manhattan.
Like,
there's no reason you couldn't create another Dr. Manhattan.
Plus, yeah, like his arrogance and his arrogance would allow him to do. I could see him doing something like that.
Yeah.
Like if Dr. Manhattan's not going to come back, we need a Dr. Manhattan. Who else is qualified to be Dr. Manhattan? Then who else is more qualified than me?
Especially with his whole Egyptian pharaoh thing. Like, if he wants to, I could see that being his afterlife.
Yeah.
Like he's been prepping himself to become Dr. Manhattan for these 35 years
to be
or something.
Immortal. Yeah.
Yeah. All complete speculation. I have no idea.
Oh, sure.
But it's fun.
Did you see that? So Jeremy Irons is played by Dr. Manhattan, or no, I'm sorry. Jeremy Irons is playing Ozymandias.
Yeah.
I'm really liking him becoming Dr. Manhattan theory, as you can tell. I noticed in my research that it's very hard to pin down something that actually identifies him officially as Ozymandias. Are we sure he's Ozymandias? Because all the other characters I've found where you could pin them down to like this is that, but like that's the one question mark I had. That could be
Maybe
that I missed the sources, because this is a very well reported on a series, and there's just so much fucking information out there. Also, a lot of vague and contradictory information out there. Yeah, but I thought that was interesting that maybe they're doing some kind of rope-a-dope thing.
I'm pretty sure it's come out in official stuff. That he is Ozymandias. There's a reference in the wiki that I do not have time currently to look at, but it is referenced.
Okay. Let's talk about some new characters. The ones that I think are interesting to talk about is Don Johnson.
Okay.
He's playing the police chief of Tulsa, because this all happens in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which we'll get to in a minute. Mm-hmm. There's also a character called the Looking Glass, which is a police interrogator who wears this like shiny chrome mask, played by Tim Blake Nelson, who you might know as one of the idiots on Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Yep.
And there's also this character, Louis Gossett Jr., which hasn't been named. Well, he actually has a name, but how old did you say he was, his character?
He's supposed to be like 105 years old.
Okay. I've got some theories about this guy, because like what we know of him plot-wise is that he meets with Regina Character's night sister.
Regina King, yeah.
Oh, what'd I say?
A character.
Regina King's character. I'm fucking...
Sister Night.
Sister Night, thank you. And gives her some like dark and disturbing backstory.
Yeah.
Shocking information. I've seen some theories that I like that says that Don Johnson's police chief of Tulsa is actually Laurie's is actually Dan, the Night Owl. Now retired permanently, but still doing something in law enforcement and justice, and kind of coupled up with Laurie, apparently working for the FBI.
Could be. I mean, the ages probably line up.
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, he was still around.
Do you have anything on the Looking Glass character?
No, nothing much.
So is he going to? I mean, it seems like he might be one of the primary antagonists, or kind of like the flip side of the coin of Regina King's character.
Could be, yeah.
But I want to talk about some of the new concepts they're mixing up too, because the Watchmen, the original series, the original comic book series and movie was about like the Cold War. This concept is about kind of racial tension, injustice, racism. And according to Lindelof, it stems from his reading on the Black Wall Street massacre in 1921 that happened in around Tulsa, Oklahoma. I think it was a Greenwood neighborhood. And this is where mobs of white residents attacked black residents and business owners in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. The attack carried out by the ground and by air. That's right. In 1921, whites firebombed this neighborhood, this business district, destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the district. At the time, the wealthiest black community in the United States, often referred to as the Black Wall Street. So it looks like now, and one of the interesting things is until very recently, this is was one of those little known facts in American history. Yeah. And it seemed like it was deliberately kind of covered up and obscured. And it's one of the America's long line of, if ever you hear someone ask, like, why can't the black community get it together? You want to lecture them about not being able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. If you do a lot of digging, it seems like every single time a black community acquires some kind of real political, economic, or other power, white America goes to tear it down. And again, even goes so far as air bombing their neighborhoods. So how do you see this kind of tying into Watchmen 2019?
I mean, it's 2019. The alternate history here.
We live in
is
a
not
society,
super
Jim.
alternate.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the 7th Cavalry has taken up the sort of mantra of Rorschach, and sort of, I would say, even warped it from what Rorschach.
Sure.
His tenets. But certainly in a modern day society, you would see those sort of organizations taking up racism as one of their mantles.
Right.
And I think I'm not sure. So I don't know much about the Black Wall Street stuff, but I do know that was a huge motivator for Lindelof and also Regina King. I know they had like a 5-hour conversation the first time they just got together for dinner, and then they ended up talking about this for 5 hours, and it feels like the show like spawned from that conversation. So something they're both very interested in. And it sort of came out of this Lindelof's readings of was the Ta-Nehisi Coates Case for Reparations article on
The Atlantic.
Yeah. So clearly that's racism is going to be like the number one driver of this entire show. It takes place in Oklahoma. I don't know how much more it's going to have to do with like specifically the Black Wall Street stuff.
One idea I had, given the age of Louis Gossett Jr.'s character, is there's one character we didn't talk about in the character breakdown because he's very mysterious. Hooded Justice is the very first costume vigilante that kind of inspired all the others. And he's notable for being costumed head to toe. There's no inch of his skin that is displayed. He's one of the few Watchmen, or Minutemen rather, that never had their public identity discovered, and also faded into obscurity. Wasn't killed, didn't start working for the federal government, just kind of blended away.
Yeah.
With his advanced age, I'm wondering, and like Hooded Justice first appeared in 1938 in this show's chronology, or maybe it's 36. Okay. But I was doing the math, and I'm like, if this guy was a baby or a small child during the Black Wall Street massacre, he would be about the age, if he came of age like 18, 19, 20 and wanted to strike a blow for social justice, to be the Hooded Justice. And if you look at his costume, it's this guy wearing this dark hood. He's got a hangman's noose around his neck. Yeah. In an era where, blacks are being lynched, like I could really see that being this old black guy who's then gone in retirement, and maybe he sees with the Sister Night, a chance to kind of pass the torch.
Yeah. No, that could be.
I'm not sure if the age quite works
It's a
out, but with him being
good theory.
106 years old,
Yeah.
I think it kind of does.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be interesting to see him be like, this, spiritual, what's the opposite of successor? Progenitor, a spiritual kind of mentor for her, to give her like, not just a law and order mandate, but this kind of like more racial justice mandate.
Like, he could have actually been around during that time. Well, would you say 21 was in when the
1921 is when the massacre
Okay, yeah, that's a
happened.
little young. It's like
Yeah.
He'd be 9 or something, or 7 or
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think if he's a baby, like if his
Yeah,
father was
yeah.
a prominent businessman, was murdered, or was
sure.
a politician or something like that, then you grow up and you see maybe this being covered up and no one knows about it. I think that's
a
got
good
some
guess.
legs to it. Yeah,
Yeah.
We'll see if I'm right. What else we want to talk about? Do you want to talk about some meta commentary? Like, what
Yeah,
kind of
'cause
legs
when
we
I-
think the show will have?
It's a good question. When I first heard of the Watchmen, I'm like, oh, this is going to be the next Game of Thrones, right? This is going to
This
be
massive sprawling series.
at
yeah.
least 5 seasons. It's hopefully going to have tens of millions of viewers. It seems to be a much smaller scale project, or a much more like toe in the water kind of thing for HBO, because they and Lindelof is no stranger to this, but as I understand it right now, there is only one season, and that season will be a self-contained story. You will
So
have a
beginning,
resolution.
middle, and a resolution.
Right. And they're not saying they won't do more seasons. What they're saying is we are going to conclude this story in a satisfying way in this season. And maybe there will be more, maybe there won't.
So I want to view this through the lens of The Leftovers, because that's essentially
Yeah.
what he said about season 1 of The Leftovers. Leftovers was based also on a book, and the first season contained the entirety of that material,
Yeah.
essentially. Now, this isn't a one-to-one, because this is not a recreation of The Watchmen. This is a successor. This is a sequel to The Watchmen. But if I look at this first season of Leftovers, if we never got another season, no one would be like, oh man, we're always left wondering. But I mean, I guess the central mystery that he said he'd never going to answer, and he never did.
Sure.
But like, you had a beginning, a middle, and an end. You had a resolution that felt good, but you also had a few threads that you could tug at. And honestly, The Watchmen itself is like that. Like, it is a standalone story, but Rorschach did drop his journal through that mail slot. Dr. Manhattan says nothing ever ends. So you're free to imagine what would come next. And
Watchmen encourages you to do that. The setup of the story is a follow-on from the Minutemen, right? Like, what happened when they took to the streets and started beating up the masked criminals in their own masks? The whole thing is a follow-on.
Yeah, so, and that's fundamentally different from like The Empire Strikes Back, where you are stopping in the middle of the next plan, and they're saying this is what's going to happen next, this is what's going to happen next, and now you got to wait to see, asking questions of the audience that kind of ponder and what, think about what happens next. It wouldn't surprise me if they end that way, but also when you end that way, it's really easy for the creator to come back and start wanting to answer those questions. So is it going to be one of those things where this obviously looks like a very expensive series to make? HBO puts it out there, and if it's a critical hit, if it gets gets a couple million people watching it, they hire Lindelof to answer whatever questions are raised at the end of season 1.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think if this is a success, which I'm almost certain it will be, the HBO will come back with more.
I don't know if could be as popular as Game of Thrones, because number one, it took Game of Thrones years and years and years to get to its popularity. Like, its first season, only like a couple million people watched it, and then by the end, 110 million people were watching it. And also a lot of the Game of Thrones stuff there's definitely allegories to today, but they were all cloaked in magic and dragons, and you had the same kind of politics, but it's politics of another world in a different time. And I think it's a lot easier to attract a larger audience when you're dealing with issues at 2 or 3 levels of remove than you're actually talking about, fascist elements trying to take over the democracy of America. And like, just there's a whole segment of America that just doesn't want to hear that. There's another segment of America that like is sympathetic to it, but like to get enough of that in the news, and then
there are 2 segments, one that's going to agree and one that's going to violently disagree with your take on that particular topic,
and what you're prescribing. So it's like one of those things where with the political edge as sharp as I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be polarizing and divisive just because we live in polarizing and divisive
Obvious
times.
prediction. This is going to be divisive as fuck.
Yeah. It's
just
going to be, there's going to be a lot of like hot takes by people that haven't seen it, probably on both sides. And
that's the Watchmen. I mean, it's set up.
Yeah.
The whole thing is designed around a fundamental disagreement, right? Of how to fucking handle the evil that you see in the world.
Yeah, because everyone agrees that the world's presently. There's very few people that think the world's great as it is.
Sure.
Most people agree that the world is fucked up.
Yeah.
The difference is what do you think the causes, what do you think are the effects, and what do you think are the solutions? And that it's so interesting because the Watchmen has kind of been revered by almost every side of the political aisle. It's like 1984.
It's got someone for everyone to cheer for.
Right. And I don't think that was the case in the mid 80s. Like I felt like it was, but it's become just like 1984 over time. You know, enough world events have kind of played out that you can kind of see a moral message in either side of it. Like, you know, if you want to look up to Rorschach, if you want to look up to Ozymandias, if you just want to like think about, whoa, man, what if it's there for you? It's a lot harder to do that when it's current times.
Yeah.
So I'm very curious to see what the reaction to the public at large is. I think it seems like I read a lot of critical reviews and no one's seen the whole thing yet. But the critics that I trust that have seen the first the early goings seem mostly positive about it.
Okay.
Like I think I was looking at like is like 91% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah.
So I'm expecting to be really good, and I'm sympathetic to all the arguments that it seems to be making through the trailer. So you know, maybe one of the things we can do is translate a little bit. We can say like instead of just taking things at face value, we can just make some of the cases that it doesn't. But I also fully expect because I think I read something that this Black Wall Street massacre happens inside the series, like they depict it.
I think it's early on in the first episode.
Like it's entirely possible the Watchmen can make its own case that it wants to. But I don't know. I've been excited for this ever since I found out that it was Lindelof's new project after the or after the Leftovers. I've always been a huge Watchmen fan, and we've got less than a week to see what's actually going to take shape.
Yeah.
Any other closing thoughts, Jim?
No, I'm good.
If you got some thoughts after seeing the series premiere of The Watchmen this weekend on HBO, please send them in to watchmen@baldmove.com. We've always considered our community feedback an important part of our show. We'll also have weekly threads on our forums.baldmove.com. If you'd like to analyze and obsess with fellow fans there, you can do so. If you are familiar with what we did on the Game of Thrones podcast, you'll be familiar with our format that we have an instant take podcast the night that The Watchmen comes out. As soon as it's over, we take to the microphones and we talk about it, and we talk about it live. And there's a second part of that called the Instant Talk, and that's where club members can tune in live, watch our Instant Take show, and then send in their feedback through YouTube's chat feature for us to talk about it live and just kind of discuss it with the fans. And if you're a club member, feel free to participate. That'll be a link on baldmove.com that goes live after the Watchmen airs on the East Coast. You can click through that and get in on the discussion. If you're not a club member, good news, it's easy to join. Club.baldmove.com is where you go to get access to this feature and tons more bonus content. If you go to club.baldmove.com, you can get a pitch for all this stuff as well as sign up. So we will see you guys Sunday night, and then our full podcast will be out each Tuesday as per usual. And we're not going to do a spoiler section on Friday because
there are no spoilers for this.
there's not a Watchmen 2 graphic novel that we can kind of like crib notes from. So it'll be unlike Game of Thrones like that, but we'll still have the 2 podcasts a week. We're really excited about it, and we'll start this weekend. We'll see you on Sunday night. Until then, I'm A.Ron.
And I'm Jim.
See ya.